The blizzard arrived first. Long before the tanks, long before the panic, long before the American lines buckled under the weight of one of the largest armored thrusts the Western Front had ever seen. The wind carried ice crystals that cut across exposed skin like powdered glass. Snow clung to every surface, burying tracks, muffling sound, and wrapping the Belgian tree line in a pale, breathless quiet. But beneath that quiet, something else was moving. Metal, treads, momentum. A pressure in the earth itself, faint at first, then steadily rising. By dawn, the ground trembled. The American infantry scattered around the Krinkelt. Rokit crossroads felt it before they heard it. A subtle vibration carried up through their boots, faint and rhythmic, like a distant drum buried deep under the snowpack. It traveled up legs, through rib cages, into teeth. An approaching armored column always announced itself this way: vibration first, then noise, then fire. But on this morning, one soldier sensed it earlier than the rest. A single bazooka man, thin, frost-bitten around the ears, coat stiff with frozen mud, shifted inside the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse overlooking the narrow road. He had no squad nearby, no spotter, no ammunition bearer. Just a two-man weapon designed for ambushes, being operated by one pair of freezing hands. He had been awake for 30 hours. His breath drifted in pale ribbons through the gaps in the shattered wall. He steadied the M1A1 bazooka against his shoulder, its thin frame cold enough to burn the skin. The weapon's battery pack, always unreliable in winter, lay pressed against his chest in an attempt to keep it warm enough to fire. A single rocket was already loaded. Outside the wind shifted, and then the sound arrived. A low mechanical growl, strained by cold oil and choked by frost. The unmistakable churn of Maybach engines fighting winter thickness. There were several of them. The noise echoed off the stone houses of the village, stretching out into something deeper than mere machinery. Across the road, American riflemen fell back into defensive positions, glancing toward the ruins where the lone gunner waited. No orders came from him. None were expected. The bazooka man occupied a position so far forward that most assumed he had retreated or been killed in the night. He was very much alive. Snow began to vibrate in patterns, tiny concentric circles forming in the powder as the lead tank crested through the mist. A Panzer IV, winter whitewash streaked with grime, turret rotating slowly as if sniffing the cold morning air. Behind it, another shape emerged. Then another. The spearhead of a German Kampfgruppe pushing through the narrow artery of Krinkelt. Rokit, intent on splitting American lines before the defenders could reorganize. The American gunner steadied his breathing. He understood the arithmetic instantly. One man, one bazooka, 7 Panzers approaching in column, infantry behind them, machine guns on the hulls, no flanking cover, no alternate firing positions, no second rocket waiting beside him. This was a choke point ambush with a single shot to define everything that followed. The farmhouse groaned softly as wind pushed through its broken structure. A roof beam cracked somewhere above. The tank engine noise deepened, reverberating through the ruins. He shifted position. Every movement was deliberate, economical, controlled by muscle memory, refined under stress. The front sight of the bazooka glinted with a thin crust of frost. He wiped it clean with his thumb. He could feel his pulse thumping through the weapon itself, an intrusive reminder of time slipping away. The Panzer IV entered full view. The markings on the glacis plate were smeared with snow. The tank commander stood half exposed in the cupola, binoculars raised against the swirling white. He turned slightly, scanning the village for threats. The gunner inside the ruins knew the pattern. The commander would lower himself back into the turret the moment he suspected an ambush. Once he did, the tank would button up, accelerate, and the narrow road would become a metal river too fast to interrupt. This was the window. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The gunner pressed the battery switch beneath his coat. The pack hummed weakly, too weak. Winter had drained it nearly dry. He cupped it harder against his body, forcing warmth into the casing. A spark flickered through the cable. The weapon came alive, barely. The wind dropped. The battlefield froze in stillness. The Panzer's turret rotated 1 more inch. The gunner exhaled once, letting the breath drift out in a slow, controlled stream. It vanished instantly into the cold. He fired. The bazooka roared, lighting the ruined farmhouse with a sudden blast of incandescent flame. The rocket hissed through the freezing air, before the German commander even registered the flash. It struck the Panzer IV directly under the turret ring, an angle so precise that the explosion seemed to detonate inside the tank's armored heart. A plume of flame burst from the hatch. The commander disappeared in a violent upward blast of smoke and metal fragments. The tank lurched, tracks grinding to a halt, turret locking mid-turn. The second Panzer behind it braked sharply, tracks slipping across icy cobblestones. The lone gunner ducked back into the farmhouse, the launcher still hot against his shoulder. He had no second rocket. The German column had 6 Panzers still functional. Infantry were dismounting. Machine gun barrels were already searching for the source of the shot. 1 man, 7 tanks. A ruined village wrapped in snow and fire, and the battle had only begun. The Battle of the Bulge did not begin with thunder. It began with silence. Weeks of it. A silence that convinced Allied commanders that the worst was already behind them, that Germany's armored strength had been shattered in Normandy and bled dry in the Hürtgen forest. A silence that covered the Ardennes like a burial shroud, and beneath that silence an army was gathering. Germany's last gamble. 3 armies, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer, Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer and Brandenburger's 7th, were tasked with driving a wedge straight through the Allied front, crossing the Meuse River, and seizing Antwerp. If it worked, they would fracture the Allied coalition, isolate supply lines, and perhaps prolong the war far beyond what anyone believed possible. If it failed, Germany would exhaust the last reserves of men, fuel, and armor it possessed. The spearheads needed speed. They needed surprise. And most of all, they needed narrow roads, tight corridors through which armored columns could surge like steel rivers. The Ardennes provided these roads in abundance: frozen trails, dense forests, villages barely large enough for a single tank to pass at a time. Krinkelt, Rokit, was one of those choke points. A crossroads that looked insignificant on a map. A cluster of stone houses and barns, nestled at the edge of the Elsenborn Ridge, but its position made it the hinge of the northern shoulder. If the Germans pushed through here, they would threaten the Elsenborn line itself, the only terrain that could anchor a full U.S. counter-defense. American commanders knew this. The Germans knew it, and so did the infantryman crouched inside the ruined farmhouse on that frozen morning. He hadn't started this battle alone. His platoon had arrived in the village 2 nights earlier, exhausted from a fighting withdrawal. They were part of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, units that had been thrown into the line to slow the German advance long enough for the 99th and 1st Divisions to stabilize the ridge. Supplies were thin. Communications were worse. Many squads were fragmented across the village, scattered between houses, barns, and rubble. But the bazooka man had been assigned to the forward edge, a position exposed enough that he was meant to fire once and fall back before the German armor overran him. He never fell back. 3 hours before sunrise, the rest of his team had withdrawn under orders. He stayed behind, partly by choice, partly because the farmhouse overlooked the only stretch of road where he could guarantee a clean shot. That vantage point became a trap, and an opportunity at the same time. His training had been simple, almost brutally so. The M101 bazooka was a weapon of angles, distance, and nerve. Effective range, 30, 60 yards penetration, up to 3 inches of steel reload time, slow under ideal conditions. Battery reliability, terrible in the cold tactics. Close ambush-only bazooka men were not meant to duel tanks. They were meant to ambush them in tight terrain, then retreat instantly before retaliation crushed them. But the bitter mathematics of Krinkelt, Rokit left little room for retreat. Snow had buried escape routes. German infantry were already moving around the flanks, and the forward positions were now isolated pockets, rather than a cohesive defense. The man inside the farmhouse understood this. More importantly, he understood the cost of hesitation. He had grown up between cornfields and sawmills, places far from Europe, places where machines were built with steel that felt familiar under the hands. As a boy, he had watched steam tractors crawl across fields, listened to the rhythm of engines working under strain. Years later, during training, those memories returned each time he studied the silhouettes of German armor. The Panzer IV, their workhorse. The Panther, the razor-edged predator, with sloped armor that devoured Allied tanks at distance. The Tiger, rare, heavy, monstrous, but unlikely to appear in a narrow village street due to weight and fuel demands. But the most dangerous German weapon in the Ardennes was not the tank itself. It was the column. 7 panzers advancing in sequence formed a singular threat, a steel fist with no softness, no hesitation, and no vulnerability, except at the very front. If the lead tank fell, the column stalled. If it stalled, infantry behind it would be forced to bunch up. If they bunched up, American artillery, if it could be called in time, would rip the choke point apart. One tank could be an accident. 7 tanks represented the geometry of an attacking army. Krinkelt, Rokit was the hinge. The German timetable depended on it falling quickly. And so, the spearhead they sent was aggressive, confident, certain that American resistance was too thin to matter. But the German commanders had miscalculated one thing: the ferocity with which the US infantry fought when reduced to fragments. Isolated defenders who refused to recognize that they were already bypassed, already outflanked, already marked for destruction. A single bazooka man represented almost nothing on a battlefield map, but in a narrow road carved through stone houses and winter fog, his position became something else entirely, an obstruction around which an entire armored thrust could unexpectedly collapse. The German Kampfgruppe pushing through the village that morning was not expecting resistance at grenade range. They were not expecting a lone American to remain forward after the rest of his squad withdrew, and they were certainly not expecting that their carefully timed push would be thrown into chaos by one rocket fired from a half-ruined farmhouse. American infantry doctrine prized initiative, not recklessness, not bravado. Initiative. Soldiers were taught to act without waiting for orders when battlefield conditions demanded it. The bazooka man embodied that doctrine with brutal clarity. He knew his role, he knew his weapon, he knew the terrain, and most critically, he knew the cost of letting those 7 panzers pass. If they broke through here, the Elsenborn Ridge would be isolated, artillery lines would be exposed, withdrawal routes would collapse in minutes. Thousands of men would be forced into an unplanned retreat through forests already choked with fog and Germans. Stopping the spearhead meant more than killing tanks. It meant holding the front of an entire army. And so, with the first panzer now burning in the snow, the man in the farmhouse adjusted his grip on the empty bazooka, listening as the second tank shifted gears, its turret sweeping toward the flash point. 6 panzers remained, behind them hundreds of German infantry, and the man who had just made himself their primary target stood alone, shivering, exhausted, but steadier than he had been in days. The battle was no longer approaching. It was here. The first explosion had barely finished echoing across the village when the German column lurched in confusion. The lead panzer was frozen mid-turn, smoke spilling from the turret ring, its commander thrown violently back into the cupola. Flames pulsed inside the fighting compartment, lighting the snow in a lurid orange. But behind it, 6 armored shapes pushed forward, their treads grinding against the icy road as they tried to navigate the sudden blockage. Columns hated surprises. They were machines of momentum, designed to flow, not to pause, and in narrow streets like Krinkelt, Rokit, any halt was catastrophic. The second tank braked sharply, tracks locking. The third and fourth collided lightly, jolting forward with metallic clanks. The whitewashed armor of each vehicle blended into the swirling fog, turning the whole formation into a ghostly procession of steel. The bazooka man inside the ruined farmhouse did not wait for the smoke to clear. He dropped the empty launcher, letting it clatter across frozen floorboards, and immediately crawled toward a shattered window on the building's northern side. Splinters of wood dug into his gloves as he moved. The cold bit through every layer, numbing his legs, slowing his thoughts. But habit, trained repetition, kept his body moving even as exhaustion threatened to blur his vision. Outside, German voices cut through the wind, sharp, urgent, disbelieving. The infantry escort had begun to dismount, their boots punched through the snow with muted thuds. One squad darted toward the right side of the road, seeking cover behind a low stone wall. Another pushed left, slipping between houses like shadows. Their rifles were raised, scanning windows, broken doors, anything that might have spat fire at the lead tank. But they were looking too far ahead. The shot had come from a position nearly on top of the column, so close that their instincts refused to consider it. Few soldiers imagined a lone defender would choose to stand at a range better suited for grenades than rockets. The gunner pressed against the frozen floor of the farmhouse, breath controlled, pulse steady. The walls creaked with each gust. Snow drifted through gaps in the roof, layering dust like flakes over his coat. He moved with the deliberate restraint of someone conserving every ounce of strength. A second explosion rolled across the village, but this one wasn't his. The burning Panzer's ammunition was beginning to cook off, sending sparks and fragments into the air, lighting the winter gloom with irregular bursts. The German infantry ducked instinctively, breaking formation, flattening against whatever cover was closest. Some turned their weapons toward the blaze, mistaking secondary detonations for incoming fire. Confusion. A few seconds of it, enough to exploit. The gunner scanned the floor for ammunition. 2 rockets lay half-hidden beneath a collapsed shutter. He crawled toward them, boots sliding silently across icy boards. The first rocket was intact. The second carried a hairline crack in the stabilizer fin, dangerous to fire, but usable if necessary. He slung the first round over his shoulder, retrieved the bazooka, and moved toward the opposite corner of the farmhouse. A hole blown through the wall offered a perfect angle, a narrow slit overlooking the right side of the column. From here he could see the second tank clearly. A Panzer IV, its turret slewing left and right in jerky arcs, searching for the source of the ambush. Its hull machine gun spat short bursts into windows, punching hot tracers into snowed-over brick. The gunner exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing. Bazooka firing positions were unforgiving. Too high, and the rocket would arc into the sky. Too low, and it would bury itself in rubble. Too exposed, and the backblast would silhouette him like a flare. He angled the launcher carefully, bracing it against a shattered beam that had fallen from the ceiling. His gloves brushed away falling snowflakes from the rear vent. 25 yards. Perfect killing distance. The second Panzer began to inch backward, attempting to widen the gap created by the burning wreck. Its turret paused mid-sweep, then rotated sharply toward the farmhouse, as if sensing movement. The gunner felt the barrel's distant gaze align with his position. He had seconds at most. He fired. The rocket burst from the tube with a violent flash, streaking across the short distance before the Panzer crew even registered the launch. It struck just above the idler wheel, an angle that drove the explosive jet into the fuel tank behind the armor. The effect was immediate. A pressure wave rippled outward, lifting snow in a circular blast around the vehicle. Flames tore through the engine compartment, punching upward through the turret hatches in a roaring column of fire. The Panzer shuddered, tracks jolting once, then locking completely. A plume of black smoke spiraled upward, merging with the falling snow. 5 Panzers left. The German infantry finally realized where the shots were coming from. Shouts pierced the wind. A squad broke from cover, sprinting across the open stretch toward the farmhouse. Their boots churned through ankle-deep snow. Rifles fired in sharp, ripping bursts. Bullets punched through the wall, showering the gunner with splinters. He dropped the empty bazooka and rolled back, sliding across the floor, just as a burst tore through the spot where he had been kneeling. Fragments of mortar and brick stung his cheek. He tasted blood, cold and metallic. The German squad reached the front of the farmhouse. Boots slammed against the doorframe. A grenade clinked off the windowsill, then rolled back out again as the gunner kicked it away just in time. The explosion blew snow into the air in a violent white cloud. The gunner scrambled toward the rear of the house, dragging the cracked rocket with him. He had no time to inspect it, no time to find a new vantage point. The farmhouse groaned again, sagging under the stress of incoming fire. The 3rd Panzer advanced, a Panther this time, sleek, angular, its engine note deeper and more controlled. It pushed around the burning wrecks, trying to reposition its main gun toward the defender's building. The gunner understood immediately. If the Panther fired once, the farmhouse would collapse. If it collapsed, he would die under the weight of stone and timber, and the column would surge forward again. He rose into a crouch, ignoring the sharp pain in his knee, and moved toward the south wall. The cracks in the floorboards widened under each step. Smoke drifted into the room from the burning tanks outside, mixing with the stinging cold. The Panther's turret aligned. The gunner placed the cracked rocket into the bazooka, locking it in with numb fingers. He steadied the weapon against the window beam. The Panther's muzzle brake loomed like a dark circle through the snowfall. He fired. The cracked rocket wobbled slightly mid-flight. Its stabilizer fin bent, just enough to make the shot unpredictable. But fate, or physics, or the narrow geometry of the road carried it true. It struck the Panther's right track at an angle, destabilizing the guide wheels. Metal snapped. The tank lurched violently, digging into the frozen ground. Its turret stopped turning. The gunner lowered the smoking bazooka. 3 tanks burning, 4 remaining. German infantry, now fully aware of the threat, and the battlefield narrowing with every second. The first contact was over. The real fight was about to begin. The air inside the farmhouse had transformed into a thin metallic haze, gunpowder, frozen timber, smoke from burning armor, and the sharp chemical bite left behind by bazooka backblast. The gunner wiped soot from his face with the back of his glove, smearing it into uneven streaks. His ears rang from the repeated concussions. His breath came in tight bursts, fogging the cold air before vanishing instantly. Outside, the Panther's crippled chassis smoked heavily, leaning at an awkward angle as its right track hung loose and twisted. German infantry had rallied behind it, using the disabled vehicle as cover. They fired toward the farmhouse in disciplined bursts, sweeping the windows with machine gun fire. Each impact sent dust drifting from the rafters, coating the gunner's shoulders like gray snow. 3 burning tanks had become accidental barricades. The German column, so tight moments earlier, was now fragmented, broken into isolated elements trapped around a narrow, icy road. The lead Panzer created a dead zone at the center. The second burned a few yards behind it, blocking any clean reverse. The crippled Panther halted the advance entirely. A trail of immobile steel forced the remaining tanks into defensive positions rather than offensive momentum. Momentum had been the Germans' greatest weapon, now it was gone. But the gunner felt the shift too, an invisible weight pressing into him from all sides. He had expended his last rocket. The bazooka was nothing more than a steel tube now, incapable of changing the course of the battle without fresh ammunition. He dropped it to the floor, breathing hard, listening to the creak of the collapsing farmhouse. German movement intensified. Boots hammered the snow. Voices barked in clipped commands. A machine gun team repositioned behind the Panther's hull, its barrel sweeping toward the ruins. The gunner watched their silhouettes through the smoke. He understood the rhythm of their advance. Suppressive fire, armor repositioning, infantry pushing flank routes. They were adapting. He needed to move. The farmhouse groaned above him, long cracks spiderwebbing across the ceiling. The enemy had begun to concentrate their fire on the base of the structure, turning the lower walls into a storm of splintering brick. He could not stay. Staying meant burial under stone and frost. He crawled toward the rear exit, sliding over debris, one hand pressed against a splintered beam for balance. The cold outside hit him like a wall as he slipped through a gap in the collapsed doorway. Snowflakes stung his face and melted instantly against the heat radiating from his clothing. His boots sank into deep drifts as he staggered behind a shed. He needed ammunition, Anything capable of piercing armor. A distant blast rolled across the village. American artillery was beginning to register the stalled German column. Not precise yet. Not enough to destroy tanks, but close enough to push the Germans into hurried repositioning. Shells whistled over the rooftops, detonating in the tread line. Smoke drifted over the village square. The gunner looked toward the wrecked Panzer IV, closest to him. Flames sputtered across its hull, but the rear compartment remained intact. German tanks sometimes carried captured American munitions or Panzer Fasts dropped by previous infantry squads. It was a gamble. He moved. Snow crunched loudly beneath his boots, each step a risk. German infantry were only yards away. He crouched low, slipping between walls and jagged shadows. A spray of machine gun fire ripped the air above his head, chewing into the side of the shed he had just left. He pressed himself into the drift, breath held, heart pounding. The burning Panzer silhouette flickered through the smoke, ghost-like, distorted, trembling with heat. He sprinted the last few yards, boots kicking up powder, and slid behind the tank's hull. The steel was blistering hot, radiating intense heat that stung his glove. He ducked beneath the rear overhang and reached blindly into an open stowage bin. His hand closed around a cylinder. A Panzer Fast. He pulled it out, inspecting the warhead briefly. The fuse was intact. The tube was frostbitten but functional. The weapon was crude, disposable, terrifyingly effective at close range, capable of punching through almost any Allied or German armor from under 50 yards. He slung it over his shoulder. Another voice shouted nearby. Boots crunched toward him. German infantry, alerted by movement, circled the burning tank. Smoke shifted around him, creating flickering glimpses of field gray coats and rifles. He crouched lower, pressing his back against the tank's radiating hull. A shadow passed inches from him. He tensed, fingers tightening around the Panzerfaust's grip. But the soldier moved on. The gunner breathed again, slow, shallow, controlled. He crawled along the length of the wrecked tank, staying low, using the hull's curved armor as visual cover. The Panther ahead loomed through the snowfall, its engine sputtering irregularly as the crew struggled to keep it from catching fire. The tank was immobilized but still dangerous. Its turret twitched in small, frustrated movement. He emerged from behind the Panzer IV and angled toward a collapsed barn wall. From here he could see one of the remaining operational tanks, a Panzer IV positioned behind the stalled Panther, its turret scanning for American positions. Infantry clustered around it like a moving ring of steel. Perfect range. He steadied the Panzer Faust, aligning the crude sights with the tank's exposed flank. The world narrowed. Snow muted all sound. Flames danced across the ruined vehicles. German voices blurred into distant echoes. His pulse slowed. The cold faded. All that remained was a single shot. A single choice that would determine whether the column advanced or died here. He fired. The Panzer Faust warhead shrieked across the frozen road, trailing sparks that cut through the air like a burning comet. It slammed into the Panzer IV's lower hull, with catastrophic force. Armor plates ripped outward. The tank buckled under the blast, tracks twisting, turrets slamming sideways as flame erupted from the hatches. German infantry dove for cover, shouting in shock. 4 tanks burning, 3 operational left, and the lone gunner had rearmed himself with the enemy's own weapon. He ducked back behind the stone wall as bullets tore into the position he'd just occupied. A German squad pressed forward, firing from the hip, sweeping the area with desperate ferocity. He slid behind a pile of collapsed beams, heart pounding as rounds chipped stone inches from his head. The Panther's turret jerked sharply. It had spotted him. He rolled behind a half-buried timber, just as the 75mm gun fired. The shell tore through the snow, obliterating the wall he had just left. The shockwave lifted him off the ground and threw him backward into the drift. Snow filled his vision. His ears screamed. His body rattled with the impact. He forced himself upright every rib aching. The Panther rotated again, searching for him. He needed another weapon, another Panzer fast, another rocket, anything. The battlefield had become a labyrinth of fire and ice, each turn offering salvation or death. The gunner staggered toward the burned-out frame of a civilian cart, using it as temporary cover. He crawled through its splintered boards, emerging near the frozen gutter that ran beneath the village road, a narrow channel, just wide enough for a man to slide through. He ducked into it, moving on elbows, snow scraping his uniform, cold water soaking through his sleeves. The gutter carried him beneath the road, beneath the line of sight of the tanks, toward a second collapsed house on the far side of the village. The world above thundered with tank engines. Tracks clanked, metal screamed. German infantry ran across the road overhead, their boots thudding like muffled hammer strikes. Snow sifted through gaps in the boards above him, drifting onto his back. He emerged on the opposite side, gasping in the cold air. A depot, small, abandoned, but containing exactly what he needed. 2 American reload crates, stacked near a broken doorway. He staggered inside. Inside the crate was salvation. 3 M6 Bazooka rockets. He gathered them in shaking hands, breath fogging in heavy bursts. He reloaded the launcher, feeling strength return in brief, adrenaline-fueled waves. 3 rockets, 3 tanks remaining. No margin for error. No room for fear. He stepped back into the snow, weapon raised, smoke drifting around him like a cloak. The breaking point had arrived, and he walked toward it. Snow drifted sideways across Krinkelt, Rokit, as though the battlefield itself were exhaling, long, slow breaths that carried smoke, dust, and the faint metallic scent of burned steel. The village no longer resembled a crossroads. It was a graveyard of armored shapes, each one frozen mid-motion, a jagged sculpture garden carved from wreckage and flame. The gunner stepped through the smoke, bazooka slung across his shoulder, 3 rockets heavy in his pack. His uniform was torn and stiff with frost. Blackened streaks cut across his collar, where blast pressure had singed the fabric. His boots sank into the snow, leaving deep, uneven impressions. Each step sent a pulse of pain through his ribs. But he did not stop. Ahead of him, the column had begun to reorganize. The Germans were not retreating. They were preparing to absorb the defenders' last act. A Panzer IV repositioned behind the disabled Panther, its turret rotating in measured sweeps. Behind it, another tank idled, its engine coughing thick smoke into the icy air. The final vehicle sat further back, partially hidden behind a stone stable. 3 armored silhouettes, cold and methodical. The spearhead still lived. The gunner adjusted the bazooka's strap, fingers numb but controlled. The rockets weighed on him like lead, each one a final reminder that his strength was nearly spent. His breaths came shallow, visible in the freezing air. His legs trembled from fatigue, but the battlefield had narrowed to a simple equation: 3 rockets, 3 tanks, 1 man. Snow swirled around him as he moved through the ruins, each step measured and silent. He passed the collapsed barn where he had nearly been buried. He passed the burning Panther that still spat occasional bursts of flame. He passed the crater left by the 75mm shell that had almost ended the fight. And then he reached a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. It led directly to the flank of the closest operational tank, a perfect ambush corridor. He crouched low, pressing himself against the cold stone wall, listening to the muffled thrum of the engine ahead. His pulse steadied, his mind quieted. He eased the first rocket into the launcher. The snow muffled everything: sound, distance, judgment. Only the tank's engine broke through the silence, a deep mechanical heartbeat struggling against frozen oil. He stepped to the corner, angled the weapon around the wall, and waited for the turret to rotate away. It did. He fired. The rocket streaked across the narrow gap and struck the Panzer IV cleanly, punching into the right side of the hull just beneath the turret. The explosion tore through the armor, erupting upward in a plume of fire. The turret lifted slightly, then settled with a metallic groan. Smoke poured from every seam. The gunner didn't wait to see if the crew escaped. He ducked back into cover, reloading as the shockwave blew snow and debris into the alley. 2 rockets left. 2 tanks remaining. German infantry reacted immediately. Rifles cracked. Bullets snapped through the air, punching into the stone behind him. He dropped to his knees, crawling beneath a broken timber beam as rounds sparked off rubble. A burst from an MG-42 shredded the upper edge of the wall, showering him with mortar dust and splinters. He exhaled slowly, waited for the firing to shift, then slipped into a collapsed doorway further down the alley. He emerged behind a low stone fence, a perfect vantage point overlooking the second tank. This one was a newer model, a late Panzer IV variant with spaced armor on the turret sides. Its crew was alert, scanning the village in tight arcs. The gun fired once, obliterating an American position 2 houses away. The shockwave rippled through the snow like a physical force. He steadied the second rocket. This shot required precision, a flank hit, angled upward beneath the turret's overhang. He crouched behind the fence, breath frost-bitten in the air, and waited for the gun to recoil. The turret shifted left, then right, then paused. He rose into a half stance, fired. The rocket punched into the turret ring with surgical accuracy, detonating in a blossom of metal and fire. The Panzer reeled, turret locking at a crooked angle, flames spreading rapidly through the interior. Smoke billowed skyward in thick, choking clouds. 2 shots, 2 kills. 1 tank remained, but this last one was different. It was positioned further back, partially shielded by a stone stable, and surrounded by disciplined infantry. The crew was alert. Their turret movements were careful. Their angles were deliberate. They had watched 3 tanks die in minutes, and had learned from it. The final Panzer represented not just armor, but adaptation. The gunner circled through a series of collapsed buildings, moving slowly, conserving every ounce of energy. His knee throbbed with every step, his vision blurred with cold, but the rocket tube on his shoulder kept him moving, kept him focused, kept him tethered to the one task that still mattered. He slipped through a shattered window into the remains of a carpenter's shop. Wood shavings lay frozen across the floor. A half-burned chair was fused into a drift. A broken workbench leaned against the far wall. The smell of smoke and resin mixed into a harsh, unforgettable scent. Through a narrow gap in the boards, he saw the last tank clearly for the first time. It had repositioned itself diagonally, using the stable for partial cover. The gunner understood immediately. Frontal armor would defeat his final shot. Side armor was obstructed. Only one angle offered a viable kill zone, the rear quarter right above the engine compartment. But that angle required crossing open ground, 50 yards of open ground. He breathed slowly, letting the cold sharpen his senses. He adjusted the strap of his helmet, tightening it against the wind. He checked the rocket's connector, making sure the battery charge was still alive. He pressed his palm against the launcher to feel the cold steel. This was it. He slipped out of the shop, boots sinking into the snow. The wind whipped at his coat, carrying sparks from burning wreckage. Rifle fire snapped past him in razor-thin lines. He dropped behind the remains of a tractor, waited for the machine gun burst to shift, then sprinted to the next collapsed wall. Halfway there, the Panzer's turret twitched. It had seen him. A shell tore into the ground, sending a geyser of snow and dirt into the air. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder. He crawled through the drift, forcing his frozen muscles to respond, dragging himself behind a fragment of stone foundation. 20 more yards. He rose again, sprinting, lungs burning, legs screaming under the cold. Bullets shredded snow around him as he reached the final stretch, the narrow path leading behind the stable. He pressed himself against the wall, breath ragged. The tank idled mere feet away. He could hear the crew inside, muffled voices, metallic clanks, the sound of a commander shouting orders. He stepped from the corner, raised the launcher, aimed at the engine plate, and fired. The rocket struck the Panzer with a violent crack, detonating deep within the engine block, blowing the rear hatch open in a blast of shattered steel. Flames erupted in a tight column, then spread across the hull in hungry waves. The tank rocked once, engine screaming, then fell silent as the fire consumed it. Silence followed, not peaceful silence, shallow, stunned, brittle silence, the kind left behind when shock overrides comprehension. The German infantry hesitated first. A few stepped back, others turned toward the commander yelling for direction, but the armored spearhead, the force meant to crack open the northern shoulder of the Bulge, was gone. 7 tanks destroyed or immobilized. Every one of them stopped by a single defender. American riflemen emerged slowly from their positions, realizing what had happened. Artillery observers spotted smoke signals rising through the village, and immediately relayed the coordinates to higher command. Within minutes, American guns thundered. Within hours, the entire German assault route was choked with burning wreckage. By nightfall, the Elsenborn Ridge held. The northern flank of the Battle of the Bulge did not collapse, not because of overwhelming firepower or perfect planning, but because one man refused to abandon an impossible firing position. His stand forced the spearhead to stall. The stall destroyed the timetable. The broken timetable shattered the offensive's northern axis, and though his name faded in the official reports, buried under unit citations and battalion summaries, his actions shaped the course of the battle that shaped the rest of the war in Europe. 1 Bazooka man, 1 ruined farmhouse. 7 Panzers stopped in the snow, a hinge upon which an entire continent turned.